Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just give folks a few moments to filter into our webinar this afternoon. Delighted to have you all here. Thank you for joining this virtual panel discussion examining U.S. arms sales and transfer policies in the time of COVID-19. My name is Rachel Stoll, and I'm the Vice President of the Stimson Center and the Director of our Conventional Defense Program. I'm watching our numbers slowly build here, so I want to make sure we give folks a moment to be able to enter the webinar so they don't miss any of the content that we have for you today, because I think it will be a fascinating discussion. So I want to welcome back any of you who've been following along with our recent events, and for those that may be new to our work, we within the Conventional Defense Program at Stimson focus on issues related to the global arms trade. And our work is really guided by efforts to ensure responsible arms transfer decisions and advance transparent and accountable processes guiding such decisions and policies. So to give a bit of framing for today's event, as part of our work, we recognize that the international arms trade really impacts all aspects of international relations, as countries around the world buy and sell weapons to advance their foreign policy, national security, and economic interests. And we also recognize that the transfer and use of conventional weapons comes with inherent risks. Too often, the global arms trade is poorly regulated and irresponsibly managed. And as a result, it exacerbates broader challenges, be it increasing the extent and deadliness of armed conflicts, limiting economic prosperity, contributing to human rights abuses and humanitarian harm around the world. And as the world's largest arms exporter, the United States holds significant amount of responsibility in mitigating these harmful effects. So I'm not sure, given current events, we could have been more timely in organizing this webinar today in conjunction with the Forum on the Arms Trade and my esteemed panelists today. So as we've seen in the headlines surrounding the firing of the State Department Inspector General, who was investigating arms sales to Saudi Arabia, arms sales are continuing to countries of concern every day, and we'll delve into some of those later in our discussion. But today we're going to talk about some of these challenging arms transfer decisions, take stock of our current policy environment, and assess the extent to which the global crisis may present itself as an opportunity for the United States to revise its approach to arms sales. As we've seen in recent weeks, the COVID-19 pandemic has halted what was considered normal activities around the world, as countries are grappling with infection rates and resulting in strained economics and economies and resources. Yet within this environment, we're seeing arms sales from the United States increasing at an impressive rate, including to governments with repressive regimes and considerable human rights concerns. In April alone, the Trump administration notified Congress of more than $2 billion in potential weapons exports. In May, we're already up to more than $3 billion worth of arms exports. So today's webinar is really an opportunity to discuss U.S. arms sales in this, in light of the pandemic. So I'm very pleased to introduce our fantastic panelists who have graciously agreed to join us today to share their expertise and talk about these issues as they relate to our current environment. First, we have Bill Hartung, who directs the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy, and who also serves as a senior advisor for the Center's Security Assistance Monitor, which tracks and analyzes U.S. security assistance worldwide. They just actually are releasing their annual report on trends in major U.S. arms sales, which we'll discuss, I think, a little bit today, a little sneak peek. Second, we have Brittany Benowitz, who currently is not able to broadcast her video. Hopefully we'll be able to work that out as the webinar continues. But Brittany is the Chief Counsel for the Center for Human Rights at the American Bar Association. And finally, we're joined by Diana Aulbaum, who serves as a Senior Strategist and Legislative Director for Foreign Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Both Brittany and Diana have vast Hill experience as well and can bring a variety of perspectives to this discussion. So I'm really excited to have them join us, all of our panelists join us, and to have all of you with us, you will see that there is a Q&A function in this webinar. You may write your questions as they come to you, and after our presentations by our three panelists, I will open the discussion for Q&A. You may also tweet at Rachel Stoll if you have a question, and we'll try and get to questions that way as well. So enough of me. I want to turn to Bill and have you put this in some context from us. What's happening right now with some of these arms transfers announcements that we've seen? I mentioned we've seen about more than $5 billion worth of arms sales announced in the last 2 months alone. Can you unpack this a little bit and tell us what big deals we're seeing to troubling countries and perhaps why?
Sure. Well, thanks, Rachel. Thanks to Stimson. I feel honored to be on this panel, and I thank you for inviting me. So yeah, I mean, COVID-19 has slowed down a lot of things, but unfortunately it hasn't slowed down the arms trade. If you go back even further than Rachel mentioned, I think the administration is up to 8.6 billion in arms offers since the beginning of March. But it's not just about the money, it's about who's being armed. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to focus on 3 particularly egregious cases: the Philippines, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. And before I get into that, you know, my overview concerns are, first of all, when you arm this kind of regime, it's essentially an endorsement of their conduct by the United States government, which is problematic in its own right. Also, there's a high likelihood these weapons will be used in human rights abuses or to kill civilians. And then finally, it undermines US security when US weapons are misused in this way, both in the recipient country and for broader US interests. So let me start with the Philippines. They're in line to get attack helicopter bombs and missiles that could be worth up to $1.5 billion. There's 2 candidates, but that's the more expensive of the 2. They also got firearms from the US last year, both pistols and semi-automatic rifles for the Philippine Armed Forces. So what kind of government is being armed here? Well, the Duterte regime is probably one of the most aggressive human rights abusers in the world. They've killed 27,000 people in their so-called war on drugs, most of them by the police or government-affiliated death squads. And there's been hundreds of assassinations as well, you know, shooting down human rights defenders, environmentalists, journalists, trade unionists. So there's been some targeting of opponents of the regime also. And if anything, it's gotten worse under COVID. 30,000 people have been arrested for violations of social distancing and then thrown into overcrowded prisons. Some of them even put in dog cages and left out in the sun. So this is not a way to, obviously, to combat a pandemic. And then in the South, also, even voluntary aid groups that are trying to feed people that aren't getting aid from the government have been harassed by the police and military. In the South, in Mindanao, there's a counterinsurgency campaign, and there's been indiscriminate airstrikes that have displaced 450,000 people and killed large numbers of civilians. And even the US State Department acknowledges that a lot of the people being killed are environmentalists and land rights advocates. So not opponents of the regime, not the armed opposition, but rather average citizens trying to make life better for people in the Philippines. So that's a capsule view of that country and some of the questions raised about selling them weapons at this point. Then there's Egypt. Now, Egypt is prepared to receive refurbished Apache attack helicopters worth $2.3 billion. And the regime of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is the most repressive in the history of Egypt. When they first came into power, they gunned down over 1,000 peaceful protesters in the streets. It was the worst massacre, probably even worse than Tiananmen Square. They've jailed tens of thousands of political activists, journalists, human rights defenders, and they also have a counter-terror campaign in the Sinai where they have killed thousands. And if anything, they've provoked more terrorism than they've prevented because of their sort of scorched earth approach. According to Human Rights Watch, hundreds of people have disappeared. Tens of thousands have been forcibly removed from their homes. There's been arbitrary arrests, even of children, extrajudicial killings, illegal airstrikes that have killed civilians. So all in all, a horrendous record. They've tried to keep outside journalists and others from actually witnessing what they're doing, but it's leaked out anyway. So I think the best summary of the Egyptian military probably came from Representative Tom Malinowski, who said the following: Egypt's military is utterly disastrously incompetent as well as cruel. The only thing they know how to do with these F-16s and Apaches is show them off in parades and air shows that are designed to make the regime look good. They do absolutely nothing to benefit Egypt's security or ours. So why would we be arming that regime now is an important question that we should carefully consider. Then there's the United Arab Emirates, which is scheduled to get over 4,500 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs, for over $500 million. And the first and most obvious reason not to sell to the UAE has been their role in the war in Yemen, where they've fought alongside Saudi Arabia in an intervention that's gone on for more than 5 years. Now, in that war, more than 100,000 people have died. There's been indiscriminate airstrikes that have hit school buses, funerals, weddings, hospitals, civilian marketplaces. And then the UAE has conducted a terrible campaign on the ground. They're primarily responsible for the ground war, where these kinds of MRAPs would be used. They've trained militias engaged in human rights abuses. They ran a series of secret prisons where people were subjected to unspeakable torture inside of Yemen. US arms supplied to the UAE have ended up with the Houthi opposition, extremist militias, even members of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And some of those arms transferred included MRAPs that were part of a prior arms deal. So it's not out of the question that it could happen again. And then more recently, it's been revealed that the UAE has been violating the arms embargo in Libya. They have a channel to give weapons to the opposition, some of which could well end up being weapons supplied by the United States. So given all of this, the human rights abuses, the inability to secure US weapons, keep them from third parties, why on earth would we be selling these kinds of weapons to the UAE at this moment? And I think similar cases can be made against the deals with the Philippines and Egypt. So really Congress needs to act. But as Dan Oldbaum will talk about, and Brittany as well, it's not so easy. Last year, Congress voted down a package that included precision-guided munitions for Saudi Arabia. President Trump vetoed that package. So we need stronger tools, and we're going to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. It's a somber picture what you just portrayed, and that's not even all of the arms deals that we've seen in the last 2 months. So we're not just looking at arms sales to particularly egregious human rights abusers, but there seems to be really an uptick in sales that are perhaps going to countries who are also struggling with the results of this pandemic on their own economies and the aftermath that they have to deal with in their own domestic situations. I want to turn to Brittany. Given what Bill just described, I'd like for you to sort of start giving us a lay of the land of the current state of play policy-wise and why this current environment is insufficient to deal with some of the challenges that we see repeatedly come up with arms transfer decisions. And if I could be so bold to ask you, like, what would you, if you had a pen, a magic pen that could fix some of these problems, what would you do to try and address some of these weaknesses in our system? I'll give you a second to come off mute here.
Thanks for the opportunity. I'm so happy that the Stimson Center and the Forum on Arms Trade are holding this event on such an important topic at a critical time. As Rachel mentioned in her introduction, I am the Chief Counsel for the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights. So I'm going to talk about the law and the state of enforcement of the law. I should state at the outset that the American Bar Association doesn't take a position on this or that arms sale for the most part. It does take a position that we have a problem with enforcement of current US law and that more attention needs to be paid to implementing the human rights provisions of relevant law. well, with regards to specific sales, I'm going to, caveat all this by saying it's my personal opinion. So, as I said, there's a patchwork of different laws that regulate the export of arms in the United States, and they are actually rather sophisticated and elaborate. And as compared to other countries' export control laws, they are probably among the strongest in the world. The problem is that it has largely turned into a bureaucratic box checking exercise where you'll see countries with long records of human rights abuses being cleared for arms sales, even though the law prohibits sales to countries with such a record of human rights abuses, just because there's no enforcement mechanism. And so I wanted to just give one example of how this plays out in the context of the current pandemic. So three main laws that regulate arms transfers are the Arms Export Control Act, the Foreign Assistance Act, and Title 10, which is the provision of the US Code, or the title of the US Code that regulates the military's activities. There are other authorities. The Commerce Department regulates the export of older military equipment. We have authorities for the military that concern partnering with foreign militaries, but those are the main laws. And we just recently convened an expert working group at the ABA that looked at the global legal framework, and we looked at the impact of foreign military partnerships, particularly on conflicts in the Middle East. And that working group found that foreign interventions in these conflicts, on balance, made them longer and they made them more deadly for civilians. And the problem is not the law. The law is good. The problem is the enforcement of the law. And so the good news is that we have the Arms Trade Treaty, and we have over 100 nations that have signed on to the Arms Trade Treaty, which is meant to reduce transfers of weapons to people engaged in war crimes. Unfortunately, the United States has chosen not to ratify that law. But it shouldn't matter, because on the books in the United States, we have good laws that prevent the sale of weapons to countries engaged in human rights abuses. For example, just to give you one that's immediately relevant to the context of sales in this pandemic, one of the big sales that was announced was the sale of weapons to India. Now, India obviously is a democracy and an ally of the United States. There are human rights abuses there, and there's a debate to be had about whether or not those human rights abuses should be a barrier to arms sales. But even setting aside that question, right now, we are talking about a country with 1 billion people, hundreds of millions of whom live in poverty, and their country is just signed contracts with the United States and with US contractors to buy over $1 billion worth of weapons. And it's a fair question to be had right now. If you don't have face masks and hospital beds and ventilators to care for your citizenry, should you be spending money on expensive weapon systems, especially when you're not formally in a state of war? Well, the good news is that the Congress foresaw such a situation and enacted a provision of the Arms Export Control Act, which prohibits the sale of weapons where the president finds that the country is directing its own resources, I quote, to unnecessary military expenditures to a degree which materially interferes with its development. Now, just a cursory look at US arms exports over the last 10 years will show you there's many developing nations who are not making progress on development and have many people living in poverty that are nonetheless spending a lot of money on US weapons. But I think that this provision has new meaning in the current context. You could argue, I think, that if there is no state of war, for example, in India, why would we move forward with billions of dollars of arms sales? Why should they divert their resources from responding to the pandemic right now? Now, theoretically, the way this is supposed to work is that the people in the State Department charged with administering the Export Control Act are supposed to check the box and say, are they diverting resources to unnecessary military expenditures? In practice, it's become pro forma that they submit these certifications that not only are the arms sales not diverting resources from development, but they are not implicating human rights. They are not, another provision that's important is in the Arms Export Control Act that if a country has misused our weapons, they're not supposed to get further exports of our weapons unless the president certifies that they've addressed the issue of misuse. And as Bill noted in his comments, the UAE has reportedly diverted weapons to Al-Qaeda and other militants in Yemen, but nonetheless, in his certification to Congress, Pompeo stated that those were rare and therefore did not warrant submitting the requisite presidential certification. So there are other provisions of the law that are key. The United States is not supposed to export weapons to countries that engage in a consistent pattern of human rights abuses. If you ask people in the State Department why it is that there are so many countries that clearly have problems with their human rights record that are getting these, continue to get weapons, they'll tell you that we have vetting, so that if a foreign military unit is going to receive training from the United States, pursuant to something called the Leahy laws, which are named after the senator who sponsored these provisions, units engaged in gross human rights abuses cannot get training from the United States. The problem is that there are literally tens of billions annually of arms sales that are not subject to Leahy vetting. So all the arms sales that Bill is talking about, technically they are subject to a version of Leahy vetting, but practically speaking, it is not effectively working. The other response you'll get from people in the licensing bodies at the State Department or in the military is, well, we train foreign militaries not to misuse our weapons. We train them on how to use them, and we train them on the laws of war. And it's actually really interesting. The Defense Department has sponsored 2 different studies on this issue, one done by RAND in 2018, one done by an outside University of San Diego expert that was funded through the Minerva Institute. And they both found that US training and efforts to professionalize foreign militaries have no correlation with improved human rights performance. And indeed, oftentimes it makes things worse. And the reason for that is that more often than not, countries that have, for example, insurgencies or terrorism problems do so because they're not providing meaningful governance to their people. Oftentimes you'll have a situation where a sectarian or partisan elite has captured the military, and the military is primarily concerned with self-preservation. So you can imagine in that scenario, providing training doesn't effectively change the behavior of the local military. They have their own political realities that they're dealing with that trump any sort of training they're going to get from the United States. So I will leave to Diana to talk more about the solution and what Congress can do to resolve this. My own view is that there's a lot of bills pending in the Congress that make sense. There are loopholes in the law that could be closed. But as you see, there are laws on the books that are not being enforced. So first and foremost, we need to figure out how to hold the executive branch accountable for proper implementation of the law. And I think that that could be done through an annual hearing where we look at the human rights report issued by the State Department, we look at the end use monitoring reports issued by the State Department, and we do a compare and contrast. And we look at implementation of the law and we ask the Secretary of State to explain their behavior on that. And there are various provisions of the law that enable members of Congress to force a vote or to request information on arms sales. And what we need is for more members of Congress to take this issue up and use those oversight tools more regularly.
Thanks, Brittany. Certainly accountability and is something that we should explore and unpack perhaps a little further in the Q&A, but it does lend itself to a conversation about the role of Congress and mechanisms that exist for Congress to exert its oversight role. And so I want to turn to Diana Oldbaum, who is my go-to for everything to do with the Hill and arms transfers, because they're really, arms transfers are not just for the executive branch to decide in a vacuum. There is a legal obligation of Congress to provide oversight to this. So I wonder if you can talk to us, Diana, about the need to sort of flip the script, as it were, on giving Congress a different role in their advice aspect of arms transfer. So I'm going to turn it over to you and hear what you have.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and I'm happy to do that. And again, let me thank the Stimson Center and the Forum on the Arms Trade for hosting this panel, to you for bringing us all together, and to all the people who are tuning in now to make this worthwhile. So just to put a little finer point on what Bill and Brittany have started to lay out, the problem isn't just that we're selling weapons to countries that are using them in abusive ways, whether it's for violations of human rights, to escalate arms races, fuel corruptions, retransfer to third parties. It's that Congress basically has no ability in practical terms to stop these sales. Even the most egregiously wrong-headed sales that Congress dislikes and disapproves, they've been unable to stop. So Congress is actually both complicit in the problem and our best hope for changing it and for stopping it. Anytime Congress wants to get serious about this and treat it as an institutional issue rather than as a partisan political issue, it can do that. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it can be done. And so as Rachel was suggesting, one of the first ways that they can do this is to do what we call flipping the script. So currently the system works that an arms sale goes through and is completed unless Congress disapproves of it.
I found this on the web.
It's very difficult for Congress to do these disapprovals because even when there is a bipartisan majority in both houses, as there has been with recent, with the sale of 22 different so-called emergency sales, which I'll get into in a minute, the president vetoes it, and you need a 2/3 majority of both houses to override a veto, and just practically that's just about impossible. So instead of having this system where they have to disapprove, they could change the system that they wrote in the Arms Export Control Act to make it so they have to approve sales. So nothing will happen with a proposed sale unless Congress affirmatively approves it. Now I recognize that this is a tall order because there are a ton of arms sales notifications that come through. I mean, hundreds. And Congress is not going to vote hundreds of times a year on each individual arms sale. But you could pick out a subset of those, either to the list of countries that are most likely to abuse the sales, or the types of weapons that are most likely to be abused, and require affirmative votes on that subset to happen. And let me just say, this isn't just some wacko idea that Diana Olbaum came up with. This was contained in a bill that then Senator Biden introduced in the Senate in 1986. So the idea has been out there for a while. There just hasn't been the political will to do that. Another thing that Congress could do is limit the emergency exceptions. So ironically, 2 days from now, on Friday, it will be exactly 1 year, the Friday before Memorial Day, that Trump announced he was invoking the emergency provisions of the Arms Export Control Act to bypass Congress and sell over $8 billion in weapons to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some other countries. And as Rachel and I wrote at the time, it was obviously a fake emergency. There was no sudden threat from Iran. All the tensions were there that had been there already. And even in the justification letter that was sent up to Congress, the administration said that the tensions have long been acknowledged. And to the extent that they were rising, it was because this administration was stoking those tensions by withdrawing from the JCPOA and other types of rhetoric that they were using. So, and now we learn that the State Department Inspector General, Steve Linick, who was just fired by Trump, was actually investigating whether the way that that emergency was determined was legitimate or not. So this is part of a pattern, certainly not unique to this administration, although certainly rising to a new level of ignoring the will of Congress and Congress acquiescing in the diminution of their own powers. So Congress could definitely put some guardrails around the declaration of these emergencies. I think there actually may have been some efforts to do this last July when both houses voted by bipartisan majorities to disapprove 3 of the 22 proposed sales under the fake emergency. The president, of course, vetoed it, and they didn't have the votes to override his veto. Another thing Congress could do is require risk assessments. So if you think of how we do environmental impact statements before you do any kind of a construction project or an aid project, Congress could require that every arms sale notice, like for specific types or quantities of sales, be accompanied by a written explanation and assessment of the risks associated with that sale, whether it's the risk that it could be used for human rights abuses or spurring arms races, unauthorized transfers, violations of international humanitarian law, and require that assessment to be made before they make a decision on the sale. And a third area that they could really change the law or enact a law to improve would be to reduce the harm done by proliferation of US-made firearms and 3D printing technology by keeping them under the control of the State Department rather than the Commerce Department. There was an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act last year in the House by Norma Torres that would have prohibited the removal of items in categories 1, 2, and 3, which is basically firearms and ammunition, from the US munitions list. It did pass the House, but it was dropped in conference. So now these kinds of changes are, as I said, easier said than done. It's not that technically difficult to write these laws or establish these procedures. It's that there's a lack of political will. And just quickly, you know, there's some obvious reasons. One is very powerful lobbying by the arms industry, which I fear will become even more powerful during this COVID emergency because of the jobs lost. They will be making the argument that you need to invest in the defense industrial base in order to keep jobs up. But as Bill knows and others have studied, actually investments in the defense sector bring less jobs than investment in just about any other sector. There is congressional weakness as a general matter. Well before this, Congress kind of sees little political advantage in taking responsibility for decisions. It's a lot easier to let the executive branch do it and then criticize it rather than facing responsibility for making their own decisions. There's the problem of public apathy. That's always been a problem. We never really had an election where people were making decisions based on foreign policy and national security. But I think that is pretty powerful now in the COVID era too, when people are very, very focused on the things that they see affecting their own lives. And I will also add another effect of coronavirus is that by throwing a monkey wrench into congressional operations, Congress is not particularly functional at the moment. And it's really, really hard to argue to have your powers restored and to claw back your authority when you're not really having votes and you're not passing legislation. So that is a real concern on the horizon for me. But in spite of these obstacles, I remain very hopeful that change is possible and that it will happen. And there's a couple of things that especially give me hope. One is what's been happening with Iran and Yemen and the authorizations for the use of military force. We haven't enacted legislation yet, but each time we've had very strong pushback from Congress to try to withdraw US participation from engagement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen, to prevent a war with Iran, to repeal the 2002 AUMF, which was the one that was used to authorize participation in the Iraq war. And all of these have had positive votes in House and Senate, and we just need to keep building on that. The other thing that gives me particular hope is that we have members who are really interested in doing this. And I'm not just talking about far left progressive members or even libertarians, but sort of very powerful members with a lot of seniority who have said they're interested in this, they want to work on it, they're eager to develop legislation and move it through. I don't know that it can happen this year for a variety of reasons, but I think that all the ground is being laid this year to make real progress next year. So I'll leave it there and I welcome questions.
Thanks, Diana. I think all of you who are watching now can understand why I was so excited about doing this event today. You know, we have incredibly compelling and dynamic speakers who are knowledgeable in this field, who not only know a bunch of stuff, but can make it really accessible and understandable to even those who are not, really in depth every day on the ITAR, or don't even know what the ITAR is for that matter. So I really appreciate our panelists breaking down these issues in a way that lays out the situation that we're all facing today as we look at sort of the trade-offs and the costs of making different decisions, not only in our own country, but how those affect people around the world. We already have several questions. I've been writing them down furiously as you all were speaking, and I can see more are coming in already. So reminder, you can use the Q&A function or tweet at Rachel Stoll and we'll get to your questions. I want to start though, Bill, there was a question when you were speaking about the decision-making process and the timeline of that, because the cases that you mentioned have very long histories of concern in terms of their human rights abuses, their lack of democracy. But if there is a very long period from the time the decision is made to when the sale and the delivery actually happens, sometimes the circumstances can change, and we didn't get into that, but could you give the audience a little bit of an idea of how long that process may last from the time when you get that announcement from the Federal Register that this sale has been made to when the weapons are actually delivered on the ground?
Yeah, thanks. It varies with the type of weapon and the nature of the relationship. But, an extreme example, in 2010, the Obama administration okayed sale of F-15s to Saudi Arabia, a 72, and also refurbishing some of their existing ones. And that was October 2010 when it was announced. The first plane was delivered in December of 2016. And so what that means, for example, is whether or not there were human rights concerns in October 2010, those planes are now the bulwark of the Saudi air war in Yemen. Now, other things could be shorter. They could be a year, they could be 2 years, but sometimes it even takes a year from the announcement to hammer out a signed agreement. So there are lags. And I think part of what you have to look at is what's the record of this regime? What are they likely to do? And think about a little bit down the road. I mean, UAE has pulled back a bit from the war in Yemen, but they could get back in, and given their record, do we really trust them in other theaters, other ways they might use the arms? So yeah, that is a factor for sure.
And I think the point that Diana made about a risk assessment accompanying transfers, and I'm sure I can already hear the pushback, but when you think of all the environmental impact surveys that are done for every construction project, right, which are far more than the number of arms sales that occur every year, there's probably some kind of happy medium, again, with having a list of countries or certain kinds of weapons that are of concern, to avoid sort of that change in situation and really understanding what we get ourselves into, because the legacy of these weapons transfers is much longer than just the actual export itself, and can really affect countries for years to come. I'm wondering, there was questions for Diana and Brittany about what the prospects are for sort of Congress supporting the executive branch's efforts to, from a bureaucratic point of view, having a more robust team at the State Department or in the Defense Department, depending on if you're talking about foreign military sales or direct commercial sales. A lot of the personnel and say the Office of the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls has really been cut dramatically, and those positions not renewed, which puts additional pressure on those who are reviewing those sales before they even get to Congress. So there's certainly a budgetary implication here, but how do you think that Congress and the executive branch, rather than just being at odds with each other, are there ways in which they can work to support the goals of greater scrutiny of arms transfers?
I'm happy to take a stab at that first, if you like, Diana.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I share Diana's reasons for optimism, and I would add to that there's a generation of people in the U.S. government who served in uniform or civilians in Iraq or in Afghanistan, and they saw that our failure to able to create responsible, respectful security forces in either of those countries led to a strategic failure. And I think that there's a lot of people in the Pentagon who really want to improve the way these processes work. So they've already voluntarily moved towards a risk assessment process. They've always technically had that required within the policy. It just used to be a box checking exercise. They're now moving towards a really robust and meaningful risk assessment. And that's part of an effort overall to reduce civilian casualties. And that's aside from any legal obligations related to the prevention of violations of international law. Regardless of whether or not it's an unlawful civilian casualty, they're trying to reduce those, and they're trying to reduce civilian casualties by our partners. So I think there are good people in government working on this, and we need to provide space for them to do their jobs in a way that is really helpful. The message I always use when I'm talking to people in agency is that the Congress will start out giving the executive the discretion to fix it. So recently, the Congress codified all of the Defense Department's authorities into a single section of Title 10, and they required the Defense Department to do a monitoring and evaluation for all of our security assistance programs. And this is a new requirement. Now, I should note that unlike the State Department security assistance authorities, which have a hard cutoff if the weapons are misused, there's no parallel provision for the Defense Department authorities. So that means that someone can use our weapons in war crimes, and we would continue to export to those exact same people. There's nothing in Title 10 that would require a cutoff. So the Congress should plug that gap immediately, in my view, and mandate end-use monitoring for all U.S. arms exports, regardless of which agency has the authority to export those. But on their own initiative, the Pentagon is trying to use the monitoring and evaluation to get a handle on why certain partners continue to be problematic year after year after year. And I believe that that's not currently funded, but one idea would be to put a fee on the licensing and the processing of the exports to fund that monitoring and evaluation effort. There's already a provision requiring licensing fees to be set aside for certain delineated purposes. And there was a GAO report a couple of years ago that said that the Pentagon had billions in reserves from those fees. So putting those into end-use monitoring under existing law could go a long ways to immediately giving them the resources they need. Now, on the downside, I should note that when they deregulated older generation military equipment and semi-automatic assault rifles and handed that authority to the Commerce Department, that cut back on the fees that we were collecting. So when you see a decrease in personnel at state, that's related to the fact that they're deregulating older generation military equipment. So I think that we, to the extent that this administration really prides itself and holds itself out as being a good steward of taxpayer dollars, there's room for improvement there in terms of making sure that if we have to hire lots of personnel to process these licenses, the defense contractors that are profiting off of these exports ought to be the one to pay their salaries.
And let me just add, I agree very strongly with Brittany that having a stronger and more robust monitoring and evaluation process would be desirable and would go a long way. But let's not pretend that people at lower and mid-level can fix this problem by themselves. The signal comes from the top. And unless you have a president, a secretary of state, a secretary of defense who are clear that they don't want this to happen, I think the people who are doing the day-to-day work are going to be very limited and hamstrung, and especially if they're getting fired for doing their jobs. I would also say that Congress, as Brittany said earlier, needs to do a much better job of oversight. And part of the problem is, and I'll use a phrase that my friend Lorelei Kelly, I think, is the one who coined it, is that Congress has given itself a lobotomy by getting rid of so many of the support organizations like the Office of Technology Assessment and many of the congressional caucuses that provided support to congressional staff in being able to carry out their oversight responsibilities. The number of congressional staff just isn't sufficient, nor their tenure, their salaries, to do this kind of oversight in a serious way. They need to create congressional bodies that are able to help staff in conducting regular, sustained, and thorough oversight.
Thanks, Brittany and Diana. I think one of the issues, and I've seen this in a couple of the questions sort of as a theme, is something that you mentioned, Diana, is that we need to increase that there's not a lot of public awareness or discussion or discourse. I will say that in the last probably 2 years, I've seen more discussion on arms trade issues publicly than I have in like the 23 years I've been in Washington. So I think we are making small steps in terms of putting the arms trade on the front pages of the newspapers, whether it's because of the IG's firing or because of particularly egregious sales to Saudi that are used to kill innocent victims in Yemen. So we are seeing more of that public discussion, but clearly public transparency is an issue. We've also seen in those same 23 years a reduction in the public reporting that comes out of both the executive and congressional branches of government in terms of what we can get in, for the data with relation to arms sales. So how, this is really for all of you, the way the questions were written, how do we increase public transparency over these issues? And are there things that the individual public can do, that civil society organizations can do to really require more discussion about these issues at a larger level?
I'll just say that this is another way where Congress kind of handicaps itself, because Washington is a place where information is power. So everybody who gets the information wants to hold on to it tightly. But Congress could actually benefit from requiring that more of these notifications be made public in full and earlier. There's so much that still doesn't get out to the public until it's too late to do anything about it. And when I was in the position at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and House Foreign Affairs Committee of looking at some of these notifications, I would be overwhelmed. There are just so many of them, and I couldn't know which one of these are the worst ones that are the most troublesome. I needed expertise from the outside to help me flag the ones that we really wanted to do something about. So Congress making these things public as a routine and regular matter would make a very big difference. Right now, the Security Assistance Monitor, which tries to keep a database of all of these, has to go begging and pleading for congressional staff members to, on the side, give them this information, which is not classified, but it's just, they make it too hard to get. And the State Department publishes it much too infrequently, too late, out of date, not in a very usable form, in PDFs, not machine readable. It just makes life difficult.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things. One is there's receptivity in the public. Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, even the Reagan National Defense Forum have done polls where significant majorities of people don't want the US arming dictators. Some people even don't think the US should be selling arms at all. But I think what's missing is a sense of the consequences. And so, for example, as Diana was suggesting, there's not enough information. I mean, you can find out when something's announced. Well, it's this weapon to this country, it'll cost this much, but it's very hard to tell when it's been delivered and how it's actually being used. And human rights groups do yeoman's work to try to figure that out, journalists and so forth, but it's inconsistent. I mean, I think there should be reporting on that kind of thing. When is it delivered? How is it being used? So that journalists and the public and others can make an assessment of the impact of the trade. Because when people have known, and I mean, Saudi Arabia and Yemen is an extreme case because it was so horrific, but people have come out and they've pushed members. In fact, Elliot Engel, who had not been very active on this, was pressed by a fairly small number of constituents, and he got on the bills on Yemen. And he was the one who pushed for this investigation of the emergency declaration, and is now raising the issue of why the state IG was fired. Was it because of this investigation that Congress had pushed for? So I think members, even with a relatively small group of, well, first of all, you have to make a relationship. You don't just yell at the person, but members who have, constituents who are pressing them to take an interest in this will do so, but they're not getting that pressure on a consistent basis. And of course, the other side has a lot of money, a lot of lobbyists, a lot of revolving door people and so forth. But I think we don't need to match their money, but we do need more people power.
I have two quick points on that. One on the congressional side and one on the public side. we're in the middle of a presidential debate where there's a lot of talk about, you know, what some people call forever wars and where we're even at war and whether or not the American people even know where we're at war. And so it's very troubling to me that, you know, members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who are supposedly supposed to be overseeing our foreign policy, they don't get notified of where the Special Operations Forces are partnering with foreign militaries, right? That is under Section 127E of Title 10, and that only goes to the Armed Services Committee. So there is, again, an existing provision of law, 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which allows any member of the Senate to introduce a resolution at any point, just asking for information. So any member could do that tomorrow. It would be privileged. It gets a vote within 30 days, and they can ask for any information they want. And it seems to me that every member of Congress needs to know where we are at war, right? And the American people deserve to know that. And I would encourage members of Congress to do much more vigorous use of those authorities to force the executive branch to at least notify all of them about those core questions that no matter if you're on the Armed Services Committee or not, if you are a member of Congress and you're voting on defense authorization, you're voting to authorize the expenditure of those funds. You need to know what's being done with those funds. So that's number one, what can the Congress do? Number two, what can the public do? Now, again, I have to preface this, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, but Code Pink has a great tracker that they've done so people can look at their mutual funds. And you can look at where's your retirement invested and is it invested in defense companies? And that's not to say that defense companies don't produce military equipment that's used by US service members every day to keep us safe. And that doesn't necessarily mean you want to divest all of your money, but it's something that we can all think about and whether or not that's where we want to be investing our money. And I can tell you, having worked on the Hill, that, you know, 10 years ago when the Pakistanis wanted to buy F-16s from the United States, there was bipartisan understanding on the Hill at that time that Pakistan, A, was aiding and abetting the Taliban, and B, didn't need F-16s to fight the Taliban, right? So more recently, we learned that the Pakistanis have been using F-16s in Kashmir in violation of our restrictions on the use of those planes. And so when we were discussing this on the Hill, you know, just by raising questions about those, I earned myself a visit from the contractors who were producing those, right? Who feel it is absolutely their right to come into the Congress and push for the sale of these weapons. And I think while obviously any congressional office wants to hear from their constituents and everyone has a right to have their views known, I do question whether it's appropriate for defense contractors to be making those sorts of decisions and putting pressure on congressmen to do that. So that's one thing that the public can do to respond to feel like they're not just passively sitting back and waiting for the Congress to act.
So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to ask a quick question to Diana. You mentioned that this was going to be a particularly challenging time to do anything in Congress, given the limited opportunity. So if there was one thing that you would say that needs to be done in the immediate term, what would be that one fix for Congress?
Wow, that's tough. And there's so many things that they should be doing. In the National Defense Authorization Act this year, I think the key is ending the wars we're in and preventing new wars, even more than stopping selling the weapons. I think the changes to the Arms Export Control Act actually are a little bit of a longer term effort, but getting out of Yemen and preventing war with Iran, repealing the 2002 AUMF are things they have done and they could do this year.
Thanks. I apologize to those whose questions we didn't get to. And I'm pleased to see that there were so many, and you know, it's a good sign when you can't get to everything, because it means that this is a valuable topic and people want to have a more robust discussion about it. I'm going to call this last section of questions sort of Rachel's pet peeves, and the arguments that people make about why we have to sell more arms than we are now, and why we shouldn't be as concerned about the end users. The one that really, and everyone that knows me gets my goat, is if the US doesn't sell these weapons, then Russia and China are going to sell them. And these are really important decisions for diplomacy and for US foreign policy. So how, given that sort of sentiment that is pervasive, and everything that you just said, how do we counter that in this environment? And I don't know if it's a corollary or the addendum to that is given the focus on the need for economic recovery in the time of COVID and the artificial understanding that if we pump more money into the defense sector, that's going to lead to greater economic recovery from the United States, and the jobs issue. How can we counter both of those sort of discussion points now, given the lack of attention on these issues in general, but even more so today? So that's sort of for all of you, as the sum up your most important points in using those pet peeves as a way to get them through.
Well, they're my peeves as well, so I feel a sense of solidarity. Well, I think if we don't do it, somebody else will, which is kind of age old. I mean, probably the cavemen were saying this, who knows? But, you know, if you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, their entire arsenal is from the UK and the United States. And they can't turn on a dime and suddenly rely on Russia and China. Their Air Force wouldn't fly without US spare parts, US maintenance. You know, so that there's a reality there that it's not that easy to kind of, you know, flip around and suddenly depend on a new supplier. They could make a purchase here, a purchase there to make a political statement, but it's not that easy to do that. And of course, our ultimate goal should be to get all countries to stop selling to abusive regimes, as is the goal of the Arms Trade Treaty, and obviously those efforts have to continue. In terms of the jobs issue, as was mentioned, anything else will create more jobs. So if you said, hey, we're going to shift from Pentagon spending to public health, you'd get 1.5 times as many jobs per dollar spent. Also, the numbers of jobs in defense are vastly overstated. For example, Trump has talked about 500,000 jobs because of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. He got off a plane and said, oh, there's millions of jobs in the merchandise we sell to Saudis. Well, we did a look at that. It's probably in the range of 20 to 40,000, you know, 1/10 of the president's estimate, which is about, it's well under 1/10 of 1% of the jobs in the US economy. So the idea that you're going to throw money at the Pentagon on arms sales to revive our economy, in fact, it's going to be the least effectual way to stimulate the economy. And of course, there's all these security and human rights downsides. You're not really getting the benefits, and you're getting the downsides.
I can go next if I think it'd be great to give Diana the final word. With regard to if we don't sell it, China will. I think it's important to understand that it's not just a human rights issue. This is a national security issue. When there are strikes on weddings and funerals in Yemen, it doesn't just cost civilian life. It creates animosity towards the United States that can last for generations. And so what the United States should be doing is stopping the use of our weapons in war crimes. If they can't, and it comes down to a choice from whether they're going to use our bomb to destroy the wedding or a Chinese bomb, I hate to say it, but I would rather it not be a US bomb.
I don't know that I have anything to add to what Bill and Brittany just said, because I think they really made a great case. But the one little point I'll add is that these weapons sales are not costless to the American taxpayer, even in financial terms. We have these enormous bureaucracies of people who have to manage and process these sales and oversee them and so forth. And what if, instead of our whole economy being so tied to weapons and war, we were actually investing in whether it's clean energy or healthcare or dealing with COVID? You know, there's so many better ways to be spending this money. I just don't see how selling weapons is helpful to the challenges that actually really face Americans.
Well, thank you, Bill, Diana, and Brittany. I think it's obvious we could have spent another hour talking about these issues and then getting to all the questions that I always feel guilty about leaving on the unanswered section. And I want to thank the Forum on the Arms Trade for helping us pull this event together. I think it really has been an important conversation. It's just, you know, it's one in a continuing series of conversations that we will continue to have here at Stimson, but also within this larger community of organizations and individuals that are working to address some of these really, you know, prescient challenges that are affecting all of us, not just in the time of COVID, but are certainly highlighted in the times that we're living in now. And I want to thank all of our attendees for participating as well. I know in these very uncertain and challenging circumstances, you have to make decisions about how you're spending your time. So I'm very grateful that you spent this hour with all of us. We are all here for additional questions. You can reach out to any of us. This event will be, the recording will be available on the Stimson webpage shortly. So I do thank all of you for spending this hour with us. I thank our panelists again for really a fascinating conversation, and wishing you all good health and safety in the days ahead. Thank you so much.